About 30 years ago, a family member needed a life-saving blood transfusion. Almost from the next day, she began to feel very tired. And this went on for years and years. There were lots of tests and nobody could find anything. And so in the end, it was believed that it was psychological. And then one day, years and years later, it was discovered that she'd contracted hepatitis C through that blood transfusion. I was outraged and took her to the Red Cross to say, look, she's really sick and needs compensation. And the Red Cross basically told me to bugger off. Through my exposure to that, I became aware of other people who had contracted hepatitis C through blood transfusions.
I really and truly believe there should be people in jail over this. I really do.
The infections happened from transfusions in the 1980s when it's claimed the Australian Red Cross Blood Service could have prevented some of it through testing.
My account begins in 1988 when I was a 16-year-old schoolboy at St Andrew's Cathedral School here in Sydney. And I didn't feel too well, and I was diagnosed with a bone marrow failure, which was called severe aplastic anemia. And to give people a reference of what that is, I was effectively the boy in the bubble. There was a chap born just before me who had the same condition. He lived in a plastic bubble. Things had moved on slightly when I was diagnosed, but it meant that I was dependent as a child on blood transfusions and platelet transfusions. And in that same year, 1988, I was transfused with a contaminated blood product, which led to me acquiring hepatitis C, which is a liver debilitating virus, and also in the 80s considered, and 90s considered deadly.
Charles and I began talking, and Charles was a real mover and shaker. And what we decided to do was hold a meeting in our church where we'd invite as many victims of tainted blood transfusions as possible.
We know some people got compensation, but they signed secrecy clauses, so they're not allowed to tell what happened. We know that.
Gradually, though, over time, the hundreds of people who are in our church, many of them began to die. And so 17 years later, when we held another meeting, only 3 members turned up.
To silence somebody that's sort of just found out they've got hepatitis C, a life-changing situation, it really scares the hell out of people. And it scared a lot of people here.
So what are we, 30 years on? It began a journey where I did my own research and my own investigations, and what I uncovered is undoubtedly the worst medical disaster in Australian history. 20,000 patients unknowingly, to them anyway, infected with things like HIV, AIDS and hepatitis C from medicines, such as blood transfusions and the product used by haemophilics in Australia, which was factor VIII.
The doctors started talking about this new revolutionary treatment called factor VIII. Haemophiliacs who had had factor VIII started to die of hepatitis B. They were harvesting the blood in America from Skid Row donors. And these basically were homeless people, prostitutes, drug addicts. Anybody who wanted to sell their blood and make a few bucks, they would take it. As this information came across the Atlantic to the UK, it was already too late, because on the west coast of the United States, this plague that seemed to be affecting gay men had already started, which inevitably, of course, became AIDS. They literally put mobile transfusion wagons outside of San Francisco bathhouses, so gay saunas. So as the guys were coming out, they were just saying, do you want to make a few bucks? Sell your blood? But what they also did was they stepped up their harvesting of blood from prisons, because the prisoners had no real say in it. They didn't ask any questions, so they just really turned this into a huge organisation of selling blood, and they didn't care where the blood come from.
In terms of the hepatitis C disaster, there's been no help, there's been no support. We did have a Senate inquiry in 2004 into hepatitis C and the Australian blood supply, and that made a number of recommendations which were unanimously agreed upon by all the senators, and still to this day not one of them's been enacted. And crucially for Australia, and why this should be of interest, the inquiry unanimously agreed that people caught up in this terrible business, 20,000 Australians infected with hepatitis C, many of whom lost their lives, many of whom were also, or a large and acceptable number of them, were also women who acquired the virus from blood products given during childbirth. You agreed that they should all receive a coordinated apology from the government.
How do we know we're the safest blood supply in the world? What we've just found out recently is that we're one of the few industrialised nations that took the gamble of sending out letters to people with hepatitis C and asking them to donate.
Why was that apology important? Well, because a lot of these women who had received these contaminated blood products during childbirth were never told that they'd been infected, even when, as I proved years ago, even when authorities knew that they'd received a contaminated blood transfusion, even when they'd interviewed the contaminated donor, they still resisted telling these women. As a result, they were unable to tell their loved ones why it was they felt so tired, so ill. They couldn't go to their doctors with any information as to why that might be, and a lot of them were diagnosed with psychiatric problems, which wasn't true. They lost their marriages, and some were called half a partner, half a parent, and some lost contact with their children because of this.
It's just wrong for people to go into hospital with one illness and come out with two more.
Years later, of course, it emerged that they weren't half a parent or half a partner or lazy or good for nothing or bad wives or bad mothers. They're in fact victims of Australia's worst medical disaster. And if that letter, which had been agreed upon by the Senate, that apology, that coordinated apology, had that been forthcoming 14 years ago, a lot of these women, a lot of children, and a lot of people with loved ones or employers that might have fired them could have said, hey, I'm not the bad person or the lazy person that you thought I was, or, you know, psychiatrically unwell. I'm a victim of a medical disaster, as acknowledged by the Australian Senate. Still to this day, 14 years later, Greg Hunt, the Federal Health Minister, would die in a ditch before he'd ever apologise to women like this. It's been recommended by the Senate, it was unanimously agreed upon, some of his own party members agreed on it, but Greg Hunt, still to this day, would die in a ditch before he'd apologise to women like this.
Because of the haemophilia, my right elbow joint is damaged and my right arm doesn't straighten, that's it. When I was diagnosed, which was 1972, my parents were told that life expectancy was 21 if we were lucky. It was a case of every time I had a nosebleed, which I suffered badly from, so nearly bled to death on many occasions. Growing up, when you're constantly banging yourselves, so you would get internal bleeding. So the same as everybody else, it's not that you'd walk around constantly being cut and bleeding, it's if you bang yourself and you get a bruise is internal bleeding. But with haemophiliacs, that bleeding doesn't stop, so the bruises just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the case of, say you bang your knee, the blood builds up inside the joint and it actually pushes the joint apart. So I mean, you can imagine the agony of it, it's literally, you know, your joints being destroyed. So over time, every time you have a bleed and it into that joint, it keeps doing this, and it then causes arthritis and the bones and the joint to actually then disintegrate. So as time progresses, the joint becomes weakened. As it becomes weakened, it makes it more vulnerable, which means it bleeds more. So then it's a vicious cycle. So it is you gradually deteriorate as life goes on. I was told that I was positive for hepatitis C, and I was told that when I got the HIV, I got the hepatitis C at the same time. If you got one, you got the other. But don't worry, because you'll long be dead with AIDS before the hep C would kick in. As I laid in a hospital bed connected to machines, literally thinking, you know, I don't know when I'm going to die, my bosses came in and fired me. Again, because of my sickness record. So, I mean, it couldn't have been any more cruel. They might have just switched the machine off. That was in 2003, but at that same time, my haemophilia friends had been in contact with me, and I was given evidence to show that this wasn't a big accident like we'd been led to believe. They knew about it. They knew the treatment was contaminated. There was warnings about the treatment long before I was born. So I became a campaigner, and basically since 2003 to present day, I've been fighting the British government for justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the most disturbing scandals has been the infection of thousands of people across the nation with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood. Today, Lord Penrose publishes a report which follows nearly 25 years of campaigning by members on both sides of this House to address this scandal. Could the Prime Minister, as the last act of his government, ensure a full apology, transparent publication, and above all, proper compensation for the families terribly affected by this scandal?
There'd been calls before for a public inquiry, but they'd always refused it. So we formed this group called Tainted Blood, and the campaign for justice began.
I know that many members on all sides of this House have raised the question of infected blood. I've spoken about how constituents have been to my surgeries. While it will be for the next government to take account of these findings, it is right that we use this moment to recognise the pain and the suffering experienced by people as a result of this tragedy.
We've been close a couple of times, and then they've taken it away. They just play games. They've had us going round and round in circles.
It is difficult to imagine the feelings of unfairness that people must feel at being infected with something like hepatitis C or HIV as a result of a totally unrelated treatment within the NHS. And to each and every one of those people, I would like to say sorry on behalf of the government for something that should not have happened.
Incredibly, last year, the British government announced a warts and all inquiry. And they did so under mounting pressure from various politicians, and also from a marvellous campaign run by British haemophiliacs and others into what is known as their worst medical disaster, tainted blood. Authorities in England and the media are calling it the worst peacetime disaster in British history.
8 months later, 60 people have already died since then, and we've only just now had the chair announced. They've just messed us around, and they keep putting consultations in that, what do we want? You know, we've had 30 years of telling them what we want. We know what happened. We don't need to be told what happened. It's how it was allowed to happen, why it continued to happen, and then also the important thing is how we, the victims and families, have been treated since this scandal hit the news. We've got little boys that died of 7 years old with cirrhosis of the liver, and the doctors blamed alcohol.
It's really a tale of two health systems, or a tale of two governments. The British government have less victims to this than Australia. They have 3 times our population. However, we've got more victims than they do.
Here in Australia, there was this willingness to treat people with contempt, treat people as second class, and almost like, because you've been born with a disability, oh well, you can be used, you don't really matter because you're not going to fulfil anything in society.
There's silence, and we're still waiting 14 years later for the very apology that the Senate unanimously agreed that victims should have.
Use them. In the UK, a health minister actually said that the cost of chimpanzees were very expensive. Haemophiliacs are cheaper.
You have the British who, after a long and protracted fight by campaigners, have this warts and all inquiry. And you have Australia, which had more victims to contaminated blood, and you have a health minister that doesn't even answer questions anymore about it. And in fact, if I ever write a letter to him, he won't reply. Instead, I'll hear back from an underling who says the case is closed.
So when you've been referred to as being cheaper than a chimpanzee, that didn't just stay in the UK, that went around the world. In Canada, during their inquiry, because they had the Royal Canadian Mounted Police got involved, they discovered that they were actually draining the blood from dead bodies, putting it through the fractionation process to give to haemophiliacs. Down here in Australia, knowingly, they would take the blood from donors who, again, just like in America, prostitutes, drug addicts, undesirable people that, when you think about what this blood is for, the worst place you could get it from, they got it. And they used it because, okay, it might not go to a senator, it might not go to a judge, but if it went to haemophiliacs, it goes through a process, well, and haemophiliacs cost money. So if you can kill them, you're saving yourself money, but guess what? You're actually making millions and millions of dollars as you're doing it because the profits.
Really, what this is about now is about the rule of law. If it is the case, as I know it is, that crimes have been committed against Australian patients, against women who receive blood products given during childbirth, against children with the blood disorder haemophilia, knowingly being given blood products that authorities knew in all likelihood to be contaminated, that's a crime if they didn't warn them. That's a crime if they didn't tell their parents. And it's a crime if they decided that the cost of using available tests and techniques to make these products safer, they didn't want to go ahead of that because of cost, but they didn't warn anybody. And so children lost their lives, women lost their families, a terrible, terrible business. And really if there is an outcome now, what it has to be is that the rule of law looks upon this, that this goes to a courtroom, this goes before a judge.
Every other country that's looked at this has found out that, yeah, it was the same product, you're making it by the same method, it's the same in Australia as in all the other countries. Crimes have been committed, whether you think that they are actually criminal, moral, ethical, human rights breaches, they're all rolled into one because knowingly these people were harmed and purely for profit.
The outcome we want to see for all those people who are still alive is that they get treatment for the rest of their lives. Sure, there might be drugs around now which help combat hepatitis C and can kill the virus, but these people suffer all the diseases that they picked up because their immunity has been so low over so long. What we want to see now is help given to those people who remain. It's only a fraction of the people who are contaminated, but those who remain now should get help. And some of those people who were responsible for affecting so many lives in such a negative way should be in jail.